The rain pelted against the windows of Friedrich Nietzsche's small rented room in Turin, Italy. The year was 1888, and the philosopher sat hunched over his desk, feverishly writing what would be some of his final coherent works before his mental collapse. Outside, people hurried through cobblestone streets, umbrellas clutched against the downpour, most unaware that in this modest room, a man was formulating ideas that would challenge humanity's most fundamental assumptions about itself for centuries to come. What if our deepest instinct for conformity is the very thing keeping us imprisoned? What if the approval we so desperately seek is precisely what prevents us from becoming who we truly are? These questions haunted Nietzsche throughout his life. Born to a Lutheran pastor in Prussia in 1844, he had witnessed firsthand how religious morality could suffocate authentic expression. Now, as his pen scratched across the paper, he was articulating a revolutionary concept. The Übermensch, not as a genetic Superman or fascist ideal as later misappropriations would suggest, but as something far more profound, a human being who had freed themselves from the chains of external validation. "Become who you are," he wrote. 4 simple words that contained within them perhaps the most difficult challenge any human could undertake. The grand illusion. Sarah stared at her phone, refreshing the screen for the 5th time in as many minutes. Her latest post had garnered only 12 likes, far below her usual count. A knot formed in her stomach as she wondered what she had done wrong. Had her caption been too revealing? Was the lighting unflattering? She quickly deleted the post, a familiar wave of shame washing over her. This scene, played out millions of times daily across the globe, would not have surprised Nietzsche. He would recognize it as the modern manifestation of what he called herd morality, our ingrained tendency to seek validation from the group, to fear standing apart. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. Nietzsche wrote in his 1878 work, "Human, all too human." Today that tribe has expanded exponentially, with social media transforming the world into a global village where approval and rejection occur at the speed of light. What Sarah and countless others experience is not merely a 21st century phenomenon, but the contemporary expression of an ancient illusion, that our worth is determined by others' perceptions. We believe ourselves free while remaining enslaved to the opinions of those around us, often people we've never even met. Consider how many decisions you made today based on anticipated reactions from others, the clothes you chose, the opinions you expressed, or tactfully withheld, the career you pursue, the partner you selected. How many of these choices truly reflected your deepest desires versus what you thought would bring approval? This is the grand illusion Nietzsche sought to shatter, that conformity leads to fulfillment. In reality, he argued, it leads only to what he termed bad conscience, a state of perpetual self-betrayal where we suffocate our authentic impulses to maintain social acceptance. The abyss of self-confrontation. To understand Nietzsche's radical proposition about authentic selfhood, we must first understand his philosophical journey. Unlike many philosophers before him who built their theories upon firm metaphysical foundations, Nietzsche began with demolition. His infamous pronouncement that God is dead was not merely a theological statement, but an acknowledgement that Western civilization had lost its central organizing principle. Without this foundation, humanity faced what he called the abyss, the terrifying prospect that there are no external sources of meaning or morality, no divine plan, no universal moral law, no cosmic purpose, just existence in all its chaotic indifferent vastness. Most people, Nietzsche observed, cannot bear this realization. They quickly substitute new external authorities, science, nationalism, political ideologies, celebrity culture, anything to avoid the responsibility of creating meaning for themselves. In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. He wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, this insanity manifests as the desperate attempt to escape freedom through submission to new forms of external validation. Nietzsche's contemporary, Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, explored this same theme in The Brothers Karamazov, where the character of the Grand Inquisitor argues that humans ultimately prefer security and validation to freedom. There is no more ceaseless and tormenting care for man than, when free, to find someone to worship. This insight remains profoundly relevant today. When old systems of meaning collapse, humans rarely embrace the freedom this affords. Instead, they scramble to find new sources of validation. new hierarchies of worth, new authorities to tell them who they should be. Nietzsche's revolutionary suggestion was to embrace the abyss instead of fleeing from it, to look unflinchingly at the lack of inherent meaning and recognize it not as a tragedy, but as an unprecedented opportunity for self-creation. The neuroscience of conformity, modern neuroscience, has vindicated many of Nietzsche's psychological insights, particularly regarding our innate drive for social conformity. In a landmark 2005 study at Emory University, scientists discovered that when people conform to group opinions, the brain's reward centers activate in patterns similar to those observed when receiving money or eating chocolate. Conversely, standing alone against group consensus activates the amygdala, the brain's fear center, triggering the same stress responses as physical danger. These findings suggest that our craving for approval isn't merely psychological, but hardwired into our neural architecture, an evolutionary adaptation from our ancestors' need to maintain tribal acceptance when exclusion meant likely death. This makes Nietzsche's call for authentic selfhood not just philosophically radical, but biologically revolutionary. Further research at University College London has shown that conformity can actually alter perception itself. When test subjects were shown optical illusions and told that others saw them differently, their brains literally changed how they processed visual information to match the group consensus. We don't just pretend to agree with others, our brains actually rewire themselves to perceive reality in socially acceptable ways. This neuroplasticity explains the phenomenon Nietzsche called self-deception, our remarkable ability to convince ourselves that we genuinely want what society tells us to want. The financial executive, who truly believes she desires the 80-hour workweek that brings status but leaves her spiritually empty. The young man who sincerely thinks he wants the relationship that impresses his friends, but leaves him feeling unknown. Our brains are complicit in this deception, releasing dopamine when we receive social validation and cortisol when we risk rejection. From this perspective, Nietzsche's philosophy amounts to a declaration of neural independence, a commitment to override these ancient survival circuits in pursuit of authentic expression. Recent studies in developmental psychology show that this conformity circuitry forms early. By age 3, children modify their behavior to gain approval, often suppressing natural inclinations that might invite disapproval. By adolescence, what neuroscientists call the social evaluation network becomes hyperactive, explaining teenagers' notorious preoccupation with peer judgment. The price of this neurological submission is high. Research from Columbia University links chronic impression management to elevated cortisol levels, reduced immune function, and increased vulnerability to depression and anxiety disorders. Our bodies seem to recognize the violation of authenticity even when our conscious minds deny it. Perhaps most fascinating is research from Harvard's Affective Neuroscience Laboratory, suggesting that the brain maintains a record of suppressed authentic impulses. When subjects were asked to act contrary to their values, researchers observed ongoing activity in brain regions associated with conflict monitoring, even after the subjects reported feeling comfortable with their choices. At some level, the brain never forgets who we really are, even when we do. The radical reframe: what if everything you've been taught about happiness is backward? What if conformity doesn't lead to acceptance, but to a profound alienation from yourself? What if the approval you seek is actually preventing you from becoming who you were meant to be? This is Nietzsche's radical reframe, perhaps his most valuable contribution to human thought. He challenges us to consider that our fear of standing apart might be far more dangerous than whatever risks authentic expression entails. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, he wrote. To be your own man is a hard business. If you try it, you'll be lonely often, and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Consider the extraordinary figures throughout history who embody this principle. Vincent van Gogh sold only one painting during his lifetime, yet continued his unique artistic expression despite universal rejection. Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 1,800 poems while receiving discouragement and incomprehension, only to be recognized as a genius long after her death. Nikola Tesla pursued his vision of alternating current electricity against the ridicule of Thomas Edison and the scientific establishment of his day. What these individuals understood, and what Nietzsche articulated, is that conformity offers a poor bargain: temporary acceptance in exchange for permanent self-betrayal. They recognize that the path to meaningful existence requires the courage to stand apart when authentic expression demands it. This doesn't mean ignoring all social feedback or indulging every impulse. Nietzsche was not advocating narcissism or reckless disregard for others. Rather, he was suggesting a profound shift in how we relate to external validation. Instead of making it the goal of our actions, we might use it merely as data, one input among many as we navigate the complex process of becoming ourselves. The radical reframe asks, what if rejection isn't failure but feedback? What if criticism isn't a stop sign but a detour? What if standing alone isn't loneliness, but the first step toward genuine connection? The transformation journey. How does one begin this journey toward authentic selfhood? Nietzsche outlined 3 metamorphoses of the spirit in his masterwork, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883, From Camel to Lion to Child. The camel represents the burden-bearing phase most of us begin with, dutifully carrying the values and expectations of our culture, taking pride in our capacity for conformity and self-denial. The camel asks, "What can I do to be worthy of approval?" The lion symbolizes the rebellious phase, the awakening of critical consciousness that roars no to external impositions. The lion tears down false authorities and creates space for something new. The lion asks, "Who says I need approval at all?" But destruction alone cannot create meaning. The final transformation is into the child, representing spontaneous creation, play, and the joyful assertion of new values. The child doesn't ask for permission to exist authentically. It simply does so with natural exuberance. The child embodies Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate, embracing life in its entirety without resentment or regret. This developmental framework provides practical guidance for those seeking authentic selfhood. It suggests that conformity isn't wrong, but merely preliminary, a necessary stage before we develop the strength to question and ultimately create. It acknowledges that rebellion has its place, but remains incomplete without the constructive phase that follows. The journey begins with small acts of authenticity, moments when we risk expressing a genuine preference, despite potential disapproval. The clothes we wear because they feel right rather than fashionable. The honest opinion offered despite its unpopularity. The career path chosen for internal fulfillment, rather than status. These small rebellions gradually build what psychologists now call authenticity resilience, the capacity to withstand the discomfort of potential rejection. Each authentic choice strengthens this muscle, making the next one easier. Eventually, authenticity becomes not just possible but necessary, the only way of being that feels viable. The transformation accelerates through what Nietzsche called the long practice of self-overcoming, the disciplined examination of one's inherited values. This involves asking of each belief, did I choose this, or was it chosen for me? Does it serve my flourishing or someone else's agenda? This questioning isn't comfortable. It often leads through periods of disorientation, as old sources of meaning disintegrate before new ones crystallize. Nietzsche acknowledged this difficulty. The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die. As well, the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. Yet within this uncomfortable metamorphosis lies unprecedented freedom. As external approval loses its grip on our decision-making, new possibilities emerge. Relationships based on authentic connection, rather than impression management. Work that expresses genuine gifts rather than status-seeking. A life guided by internal compass, rather than external applause. Nietzsche in dialogue, contrasting perspectives on authentic selfhood. How does Nietzsche's radical vision of authentic selfhood compare with other philosophical traditions? His ideas didn't emerge in isolation, but represent one powerful voice in humanity's ongoing conversation about authenticity. By placing his thought in dialogue with other perspectives, we can better appreciate both its uniqueness and its limitations. The existentialist kinship. Perhaps Nietzsche's closest philosophical relatives are the existentialists who followed him. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. Though they developed their ideas decades after Nietzsche's death, they built upon his fundamental insight that existence precedes essence, that humans are not born with predetermined purposes, but must create meaning through their choices. Sartre's famous declaration that man is condemned to be free echoes Nietzsche's recognition of the burden authentic selfhood places on the individual. Both philosophers saw that many people flee from this freedom into what Sartre called bad faith, self-deception that allows escape from the responsibility of self-creation. Yet important differences exist. Where Nietzsche emphasized the creation of new values through the will to power, Sartre focused more on the inescapability of choice itself. For Sartre, even choosing not to choose is still a choice for which we bear responsibility. His example of the waiter who adopts his role so completely that he becomes a caricature of waiterness illustrates how humans often flee authentic selfhood by identifying too completely with social roles. Simone de Beauvoir extended these insights specifically to women's experience, arguing in The Second Sex that women have historically been denied the freedom of authentic self-creation, instead being defined entirely in relation to men. Her work suggests that authentic selfhood isn't merely a philosophical choice, but one constrained by social and political realities, a consideration less prominent in Nietzsche's individualistic approach. Albert Camus, while sharing Nietzsche's recognition of life's inherent meaninglessness, diverged in his response to this condition. Where Nietzsche advocated for the creation of new values through the will to power, Camus proposed rebellion and lucid acceptance. His essay The Myth of Sisyphus concludes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, even in the endless repetition of a seemingly meaningless task. This subtle shift from creation to rebellion represents an important alternative to Nietzsche's more heroic conception of authenticity. Eastern resonances and contrasts. Perhaps surprisingly, Nietzsche's thought finds both striking parallels and stark contrasts with Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly Buddhism and Taoism. Though Nietzsche himself was often critical of Buddhism, which he somewhat misunderstood as life-denying, contemporary scholars have noted remarkable similarities. Like Nietzsche, the Buddha recognized suffering as intrinsic to human existence and identified attachment to fixed identity as a primary cause of this suffering. The Buddhist concept of anatta no-self argues that what we perceive as a stable self is actually an illusion, a collection of constantly changing processes without any fixed essence. This resonates with Nietzsche's critique of the Cartesian self as a grammatical fiction rather than a metaphysical reality. However, the prescribed responses to this realization differ dramatically. Where Nietzsche advocates for the creative assertion of the will to power, Buddhism suggests the dissolution of attachment to self through meditative practice. The Buddhist path leads to nirvana, a state beyond suffering, while Nietzsche's leads to a more intensified engagement with life's struggles through a more fatty love of fate. Taoism offers another interesting counterpoint with its concept of wu wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. The Taoist sage achieves authenticity, not through heroic self-assertion, but by aligning with the natural flow of existence, the Tao. As Lao Tzu writes in the Tao Te Ching, the sage does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone. This contrasts sharply with Nietzsche's emphasis on the will to power, but resonates with his concept of the child stage in the three metamorphoses, the spontaneous, playful creation that comes not from strained effort, but from natural expression of one's being. Both traditions recognize that the most profound authenticity often feels less like work and more like play. Modern psychology, scientific validation. While Nietzsche anticipated many psychological insights through pure introspection and observation, modern psychology has provided empirical support for many of his ideas while developing alternative frameworks for understanding authentic selfhood. Carl Jung, whose analytical psychology bears strong Nietzschean influences, developed the concept of individuation, the process of integrating unconscious elements of the psyche to achieve wholeness. Jung's framework suggests that authentic selfhood requires not just courage in the face of social disapproval, as Nietzsche emphasized, but also reconciliation with the shadow self, those disowned aspects of personality that we repress from conscious awareness. Where Nietzsche focused primarily on overcoming social conformity, Jung recognized that we must also overcome our own internal resistance to wholeness. His concept of the persona, the social mask we wear, parallels Nietzsche's critique of social conformity, but Jung saw integration, rather than rebellion, as the path to authenticity. Humanistic psychologists, like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, developed theories of self-actualization that echo Nietzsche's concern with authentic becoming. Rogers' concept of congruence, the alignment between actual experience, conscious awareness, and communication, provides a practical framework for evaluating authentic expression that complements Nietzsche's more philosophical approach.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, culminating in self-actualization and self-transcendence, offers a developmental perspective on authentic selfhood. Unlike Nietzsche, who sometimes seemed to suggest that authentic selfhood was available only to exceptional individuals, Maslow's research suggested that self-actualization represents a universal human potential that emerges when lower-level needs are satisfied. Contemporary positive psychology has further developed these insights through research on authentic happiness and flow states. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow, the state of complete immersion in optimally challenging activity, suggests that authenticity is found not just in rebellion against social norms, but in moments of total engagement, where self-consciousness temporarily dissolves. These psychological frameworks don't contradict Nietzsche's fundamental insights, but expand upon them with empirical research and practical applications. They suggest that authentic selfhood involves not just courage against external pressures, but integration of internal divisions, satisfaction of basic needs, and engagement in optimally challenging activities. Political dimensions. The social self. One significant limitation of Nietzsche's approach to authentic selfhood is its relative neglect of social and political dimensions. While he brilliantly analyzed how social forces constrain individual expression, his solution remained primarily individualistic, focused on personal overcoming, rather than collective transformation. Marxist thought provides an important counterpoint here. From a Marxist perspective, authentic selfhood cannot be achieved solely through individual will, but requires transformation of the material conditions that shape consciousness. As Marx famously wrote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness." This analysis suggests that a factory worker alienated from their labor cannot simply overcome this condition through philosophical insight. Material conditions of production must change for authentic expression to become possible. The Marxist critique reminds us that authentic selfhood has prerequisites beyond individual courage, including economic systems that don't reduce humans to mere productive functions. Feminist theory similarly emphasizes how gender norms and patriarchal structures constrain authentic expression, particularly for women. Theorists like bell hooks argue that authentic selfhood requires not just personal rebellion, but collective struggle against systems of domination that define acceptable identities along gendered, racial, and class lines.
These perspectives don't invalidate Nietzsche's insights but highlight their incompleteness. Authentic selfhood may indeed require the courage to stand apart from social expectations, but it also requires social conditions that make such courage possible for everyone, not just privileged individuals with the material security to risk disapproval. Religious counterpoints, transcendent, authenticity. Perhaps the starkest contrast to Nietzsche's vision comes from religious traditions that locate authentic selfhood not in self-creation but in relationship with the divine. From traditional Christian, Jewish, and Islamic perspectives, authenticity comes not from asserting one's will but from aligning it with God's purpose. As Augustine of Hippo expressed it in his Confessions, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." This view suggests that authentic selfhood comes not from creating one's own values, but from discovering one's place within a divinely ordained cosmic order. The 20th century Jewish philosopher Martin Buber offered a more nuanced religious perspective in his work, And Thou. Buber suggested that authentic selfhood emerges not in isolation but in genuine encounter with an eternal thou, whether understood as God or as the sacred dimension of relationship itself. This dialogical understanding of authenticity contrasts with Nietzsche's more solitary vision of the self-creating individual. Christian existentialists, Søren Kierkegaard, who influenced Nietzsche despite their different conclusions, argued that authentic selfhood requires a leap of faith, a commitment beyond rational calculation to a transcendent source of meaning. His concept of the knight of faith, exemplified by the biblical Abraham, suggests that the highest authenticity may involve submission to divine will rather than self-assertion. These religious perspectives challenge Nietzsche's core assumption that the death of God necessitates self-creation of values. They suggest instead that authentic selfhood might be found in recovering or deepening relationship with transcendent reality rather than in heroic self-invention. Contemporary relevance, digital identity, and authenticity. How might Nietzsche respond to our contemporary crisis of authenticity in the digital age? The philosopher who warned about the herd mentality could scarcely have imagined social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement through confirmation bias and tribal signaling. Modern social theorists like Sherry Turkle have documented how digital technologies simultaneously promise connection while often delivering its shallow simulation. Her research shows how constant performance online leads many to experience what she calls alone together, a state of constant connection without authentic presence. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han argues in The Burnout Society that contemporary capitalism has internalized Nietzsche's will to power in distorted form, transforming it from creative self-expression into relentless self-optimization. The modern individual becomes an achievement subject, freely choosing their own exploitation in pursuit of optimization metrics that promise but never deliver authentic fulfillment. These analyses suggest that Nietzsche's warnings about the flight from authentic selfhood have become even more relevant in digital capitalism, which offers unprecedented opportunities for comparison, performance, and external validation. The courage to stand apart has perhaps never been more difficult, nor more necessary. Yet contemporary philosophy also offers perspectives that move beyond Nietzsche's sometimes overly individualistic framing. Philosophers of care ethics like Nell Noddings emphasize that authentic selfhood emerges not in heroic isolation but in networks of relationship and mutual care. This suggests that the path to authenticity may lie not just in standing apart when necessary, but in standing together in more genuine ways. Beyond Nietzsche, integrated authenticity, what emerges from this comparative analysis is not a refutation of Nietzsche's insights, but an invitation to integrate them within a more comprehensive understanding of authentic selfhood. His emphasis on courage against conformity remains essential but incomplete when divorced from considerations of relational flourishing, material conditions, and the integration of unconscious aspects of the self. Perhaps authentic selfhood in the fullest sense involves not just Nietzschean courage, but also Buddhist compassion, Marxist solidarity, feminist consciousness, psychological integration, and even religious receptivity to transcendent dimensions of experience. Not a single heroic act of self-creation, but an ongoing practice of attentive presence to both our uniqueness and our interconnection. The most profound freedom might be found not in isolated self-assertion alone, but in the capacity to move fluidly between autonomy and connection, between self-creation and receptivity, between standing apart and standing together. Not just in being entirely self-determined, but in being responsible, capable of authentic response to the call of others and the call of the moment. The phoenix rising. Imagine standing on a cliff edge overlooking a vast canyon. Behind you lies the familiar territory of conformity, the well-trodden paths of social expectation, the comfortable certainty of knowing exactly who you're supposed to be. Before you stretches the unknown expanse of authentic becoming, magnificent in its possibilities, but terrifying in its lack of guarantees. This is the precipice Nietzsche invites us to consider, not with the demand that we leap, but with the suggestion that flight might be our natural state, that we were never meant to crawl along predetermined paths, but to soar according to our unique design. The metaphor of the phoenix resonates here, the mythical bird that must burn completely to be reborn. Authentic becoming often requires a kind of death, the dissolution of a socially constructed identity before a truer self can emerge. This process rarely happens once, but recurs throughout a life well lived, each cycle bringing greater authenticity. We see this pattern in countless human journeys: the executive who walks away from status and security to pursue creative work, the individual who finally acknowledges their sexual orientation after years of denial, the religious person who questions inherited dogma to discover a more personal spirituality. Each experiences a dissolution that precedes integration at a higher level of authenticity. Nietzsche's enduring gift to humanity might be his recognition that this painful metamorphosis isn't pathology but health, not breakdown but breakthrough. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star, he wrote. The disorientation that accompanies authentic becoming isn't failure but a necessary phase in human development. Perhaps most remarkably, Nietzsche arrived at these insights while suffering from crippling physical ailments that would eventually lead to his complete mental collapse. He lived his philosophy in the most challenging circumstances imaginable, refusing to surrender his intellectual integrity despite isolation, physical pain, and public misunderstanding. On January 3, 1889, Nietzsche witnessed a coachman beating a horse in the streets of Turin. Something in this act of cruelty broke the philosopher's already fragile psyche. He ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed into an insanity from which he would never recover. He spent his remaining years in the care of his sister and mother, largely unaware of how his work was beginning to transform Western thought. Today, Nietzsche's challenge echoes more urgently than ever. In an age of unprecedented social surveillance, when algorithms quantify our likability and conformity technologies reach into every aspect of human experience, his call to authentic selfhood represents not just philosophical wisdom but a crucial survival strategy for the human spirit. The path he illuminates isn't easy. It demands courage few are willing to cultivate, it promises no external rewards, and guarantees substantial resistance. Yet it offers something far more valuable, the possibility of a life that feels like your own. Become who you are. The invitation still stands, waiting for those brave enough to accept it, not as a destination to be reached, but as an ongoing process of shedding inherited limitations and embracing one's distinctive possibilities, not as a selfish rejection of community, but as the prerequisite for genuine connection, not as a perfect achievement, but as a direction worthy of our finest efforts. In the end, Nietzsche's message distills to this: no one can tell you who you are, no one can live your truth, no one can walk your path, and still, you must walk. Not because walking brings approval, not because walking makes you better than others, but simply because it is your walk, and no one else's. The most profound freedom might be realizing that you no longer need permission to be exactly who you are.